I'm after something. I'm after something like a hunter after its quarry. I'm after painting. But painting is very elusive. And once you think you've caught it by its tail, it's off again. So you never get there. Now, I don't really think I'm setting out to express something. I'm trying to make paintings that are eloquent, that speak, that they speak to other people, that they are eloquent in themselves through the paint.
I remember walking through the Picasso Museum in Antibes and seeing this extraordinary painting. And I look at it and I go, it says Anne Madden. I said, Anne Madden, that can't be our Anne Madden. And because she was the only, and there was all just mostly Picassos or major figures. And I thought, we don't know what we have here. This is a woman with incredible international renown.
I don't think Anne could be lost in anyone's shadow, quite frankly. I mean, I think that she is a formidable person, a formidable painter and a formidable artist. And I think that she's always maintained a consistent individual presence in her own right.
Something which I deeply respect, she's immensely ambitious. I mean, ambitious as an artist, as a painter.
Her paintings are not just beautiful paintings that you just look at. This vibration, I think, is in a way is also a metaphor of meaning or whatever, but it makes the paintings big presences that are sort of active and demanding.
It's not really about menhirs and standing stones and dolmens. It's about paint. Her painting is about paint.
As a child, I was passionately involved, hour after hour after hour, of smashing open little pebbles that I had picked up from the street or from the ground, wherever I was, and opening them to see what was inside. They were little worlds, very often extremely beautiful, crystalline, different colours, and they were the hidden side of this very ordinary looking little pebble on the outside. And I think that artists are very often involved in trying to make visible invisible aspects of the world. And there are all kinds of invisible aspects that are perfectly real to us, like psyche, imagination, consciousness, a feeling. And I think that's one of the things that I've been involved in my work, is trying to make visible invisible aspects of the world.
Anne Madden was born in London in 1932 into an Irish and Anglo-Chilean family steeped in history and rich with characters. And though Anne spent her earliest years in Chile before the family moved to England, her strongest affinity was with her father and his Irish heritage. Much later in 1965, Anne represented Ireland at the Paris Biennale. This inherent love of Ireland traces back to her great-grandfather who had emigrated to Chile.
He was Irish and he married an Irish woman out there. And sent his daughters, 4 daughters, to the Loreto convent in Rathfarnham with their governess, where they started the school orchestra. They all played different instruments, the 4 girls. My father was sent to Ampleforth when he was 8, was a brilliant scholar and a brilliant actor. He then went to Oxford, and when he'd finished Oxford, he went back to Chile and married my mother. where I was conceived, and to my dismay, much later on, my mother insisted on having her children in England, and she would journey the 6,000 miles. It's sort of mind-boggling, and to have them in London and then return to Chile. Well, my father considered himself Irish and brought me to Ireland when I was 11, where I instantly fell in love with Ireland.
I came to know the Burren really well through my wife Anne Madden, who spent her girlhood there and who knew every crevice and cranny of the place. And I saw it anew through her eyes.
I just adored that place. You know, all my holidays in my adolescence were spent there, and I rode horseback around all the limestone lanes of the Burren, exploring it and finding the megalithic tombs, and I was utterly entranced by it, where the people in the village would say to me, "Where are you going? To that dark old gloomy old place again?" They'd say, about the Burren. Nobody went there.
In Anne's early paintings, inspired as they were by the Irish Burren landscape, her affinity with abstract expressionism at that time seemed to me to reflect the freedom and spontaneity of her own nature.
I wanted the Burren paintings to be free. I mean, I did them in the 60s, and I wanted them to be free of any kind of directioning by my hand. So that is why I poured the paint. And I think that probably the autonomy of the paint actually may have called up certain things from myself that wouldn't otherwise have appeared. And it was extraordinary in many ways, because although it was extremely risky, it didn't seem to alter the outcome that much. The megalith paintings directly follow the Burren paintings. Although they're conscious of the transformative role of paint, they are also infused with an emotional content. And that emotional content is elegiac insofar as it is a lament. And it's a lament for the atrocities that were perpetrated at the time in the 70s in Northern Ireland, or Riven, Northern Ireland. My sister Vivian was born 2 years before me. So we were close in years and always together, more or less, in our lives.
Anne became deeply attached to her brother Jeremy, who was born when she was 9. His arrival was most timely, as Anne was grieving the recent death of her precious 2-year-old Down syndrome brother, to whom she had been devoted.
It was a very strange childhood, really. I think that my mother was not really very keen on being a mother. And in those days, of course, there was nothing you could do about it. There was no pill you could take. So she had 4 children. And I think she found my sister and myself difficult insofar as we wanted to do things. and we were quite wild. We went down to Somerset at this stage in the proceedings. We were very young, and stag hunted down there, and all on our own, stayed in a little tiny hotel in the middle of Exmoor, where it was very beautiful, wild country, you know, it was Lorna Doone country. I was a romantic little girl of 10 and had read Lorna Doone and would ride over the places that were in the book, thinking this was absolutely wildly romantic. And we rode all day, drank out of the streams, had sandwiches in our pockets, or cow cake. I used to eat cow cake, got terrible worms. But nobody knew. No, there was nobody there to look after us, and it was a most extraordinary situation. There were lots of children down there, and we all rode together in a band, and I was very happy. It was my father's decision, and we were sent to a convent in Harrogate, which was a most unfortunate place. We were both unhappy there. They said when we arrived at the convent, in the big, huge gymnasium, and it seemed huge when one was 7, with all these trunks around, you know, all the girls' trunks, this woman, Mother Mary Immaculata, who was in charge of us juniors, said, "And now you are going to forget all about your parents. You're here now." I'll never forget the words. I think girls also, at that epoch, you know, the parents wanted sons. I think there was a sort of dynastic thing, you know, my father would have preferred boys. That's the impression I got. That girls were really, you know, from my mother I got the really strong impression girls were not really, they was inferior to boys. And I don't know whether this accounted for being sent away all the time. Although I suppose one missed a home, you don't know what you miss when you're children. They were very well-off parents, you know, one lacked for nothing, materially. And we were then sent to a most wonderful school, which was in Oxford. You know, I was a rebel by then because of all the things that had gone behind, you know, turned me and my sister into rebels. And so we were against any authority because we'd been let go. And our parents hadn't been around, really. So we were rebels really without a cause, and were extremely disruptive elements in the school, which was quite unnecessary because the school was so liberal, they didn't need us and our antics. But however, they were very, very, very tolerant. I was called one day to see the headmistress, and the art mistress was there. And they said, "We have very, very good news for you." And so I said, "Oh." And they told me that a painting of mine that had been chosen, had been sent to an exhibition in Europe for refugee children, refugees from the war, and that it had been sold. Wasn't that wonderful? And I listened to this with growing dismay, and I said, "What painting?" And they told me, their faces beginning to fall like mine, and they told me it was the flight into Egypt, and I said, "That painting? You sent that painting?" And I was terribly, desperately upset because I knew it was no good. So I told them that I couldn't speak. I was so upset, and I told them that I would never go to art class again, and that I would destroy everything that there had been kept in the drawer that was mine, so that they would never be able to do any such thing ever again without asking me. And it was left like that.
If you just meet her in a public setting sometimes, because of her very, how shall I put it, extravagant persona, she can appear to be somebody who is very sure of herself and incredibly certain about her cogito and who she is and what she is. And she certainly has convictions and commitments that are very deep. But at times, I think it's more in her painting that the fragility and the interiority and the deep subjectivity expresses itself.
While Anne loved her brother Jeremy and her sister Vivian intensely, her relationship with her mother could not be described as close. And as she grew into adolescence, Anne had many questions which she wished to address to her father, a man she greatly admired. But tragedy struck most forcefully when his car was crushed by a bus.
My father was killed in the accident, and a very tragic accident, and in a car which contained 3 people whose lives had come to a kind of, his own life had come to a point where he didn't really know what was going to happen. He'd fallen in love in the war with a great-granddaughter of the poet William Wordsworth, who was a wonderful woman who I got to know later on. And she lost her husband and my father in the same accident when she was 27. It's terrible what happens. They unravel you, you know, these things. They unravel your whole being. And it takes an awful long time to knit yourself together again, and much longer than people think. And they also, they isolate you. So you feel at school completely isolated. You're surrounded by this terrible thing that's happened. It's all around you, like something which is almost solid. And you don't want anybody near you. You don't want anybody to touch you. You don't want anybody to say they're terribly sorry or anything like that. That would be fatal. You know, you become, I suppose, wild with grief.
Anne's strong spirit spurred her on, and she was accepted into the prestigious art school in Chelsea when she was 18. Her love of horse riding brought her constantly back to Ireland and almost cost her her life. While riding in a hunt, Anne cleared a wall only to land in a frozen boreen crushed under the full weight of her horse.
There was a priest in the boreen who came up to me, and he said, he helped me up. Rather, I think, without much caution. And he said, "Where are you hurt?" And I said, "Well, I think it's my arm." So he got hold of my arm and he went up and down with my arm. "Oh, sure, it's not broken," he said. "I'll give you a leg up." Because it was my spine. So he gave me a leg up, and she took me home. She knew the way home. It was about 10 miles from home. She took me home, my mare. And from then on, you know, it got more and more painful, but I didn't dare tell anybody. I knew it was really bad. And so when my sister married when she was 21, she said, "Would you do something for me?" And I said, "Yeah, anything you ask me." She said, "You go to somebody about your spine."
And so began 3 grueling, pain-filled years at the hands of surgeons, most of whom believed that Anne would be in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. After 2 failed operations and 3 8-month periods confined in a plaster sarcophagus, Anne's determination triumphed.
You have to remember, I was flat on my back, so I could only move my arms. So it was impossible to do anything. And I read a great deal and listened to music and that kind of thing, and wrote. But it definitely held me up, and it was, as I say, frustrating. And I think it was a long time before that I had the feeling that I had little bits of brain in my fingertips. I felt that they had little bits of brain now, and that they would know the world. I would know the world through my hands.
I think it was in 1951, when visiting the Irish exhibition of living art, I came across a highly original painting of crows strutting in a field under an archway formed by the legs and belly of a horse. I did not meet Anne herself until 1956, 5 years later, at a party in London.
The meeting was nearly didn't take place. It was a party given by a friend of his who I'd met very recently with my sister in London, Peter Luke, who was a close friend of his and who lived in one of the studios in Battersea where he lived. And they gave a joint party, and at the last minute I decided I wouldn't go. I told my sister, and my sister said, "I'm sorry, you've got to come because you're the reason we've been asked." So I went along, and then I saw this man standing by the stairs in the studios, in the ladder stairs going up to the mezzanine bedroom, and I thought he was devastating, but he did look to me a little bit like a guards officer, so my interest vanished. And then later on, Peter Luke said to me, "Do you know Louis Le Brocquy?" And I said, "No, I've never met him." And he said, "We're giving the party together." I said, "Well, you didn't tell me, you know." And so he rushed off, blustering a bit, and came back with the guards officer. And that was that. Fatal meeting.
I fell in love with her instantly, and from that day on, saw her almost every day of my life. I also discovered in those very early days Anne's near outrageous sense of humour and fun, as well as her very stimulating mind, which has enlivened my life ever since.
Well, I was in the middle of my operations insofar as they had failed, the first lot, and I was due to go in for the third one a couple of months later, after we met. So I was very, very chary of anybody coming, forming a relationship with somebody. I didn't even know if I'd lived through it. And soon that was hopeless, That very quickly left me, that hesitation. And Louis went through this terrible operation with me, really. Eventually I was allowed home in my plaster case. And doctors would come, 3 strong doctors in the same practice would come once in a while, and they'd put my lid on and turn me over so that my back could be washed. The surgeons advised us to live in a warm climate. So all these things decided us to go and live in France, in the south of France. I chose Chartres Cathedral, which was just the nicest place, the most beautiful place I could think of to get married in, and also it evaded a social wedding, which I couldn't stand the idea of because I regarded the marriage as a very private, personal thing.
From Chartres, we headed southwards to Carros in the Alpes-Maritimes, to a climate recommended by Anne's surgeons. Our first studio was designed overlooking a terraced olive grove by our friend, the great Irish architect, Ronnie Tallon. And there and then we settled down to work in the marvellous light of the French Midi.
Louis has the amazing capacity of being able to abstract himself from his surroundings almost completely and concentrate on the thing he's doing. So I think this helped him to put up with me, because I made noise and mess. And in any case, there was usually music playing to muffle my end. His end would be like a surgeon's. Everything in its place, all beautifully laid out. I think it was a kind of fluke that we managed to work together, because we have nothing in common from the point of view of in our work. That is to say, that we come from different painters. And you could say that Louis came from Picasso, and you could say that I came from Matisse. And with all that that means, it means a huge amount when I say that.
I should say that I think Anne Madden comes from the tradition of abstract expressionism, and I'm sure she admires Rothko, that uses colors in the same way, or de Kooning that makes these very bold expressionistic paintings. But I think she's not an abstract painter, really. A lot of the works are abstract, but some refer to architecture, or they have things on, so immediately you read them as skies or seas, and I would read them as well, sometimes metaphorically, as inner visions.
I suppose what fascinated me about Pompeii was its apocalyptic end, and the feeling I've always had that anything can happen at any time has always been an outrider to my life. We went to Pompeii one bleak winter's day with Vesuvius casually smoking behind the ruins. And from this came the openings, windows, thresholds into another space, another kind of space, which I was after, the pretext being Pompeii. And I think that those windows and doorways were a reflection of my wanting to move into another area. I think what was remarkable about the studio relationship, if you like to call it that, was that we were both able to see each other's work with a fairly objective eye, or learned to do that. Maybe I learned to do that.
Francis Bacon told me more than once how he envied this third eye which Anne brought to my work.
Of course, it's always interesting to watch somebody else painting, and I used to sit sometimes for hours when I couldn't work, when my brother, especially when my brother died. And I would sit there for ages watching him work, which was lovely, because I watched paintings coming into being. And we all make things out of nothing. Art is made out of nothing.
Anne Madden's paintings hang in some of the most prestigious collections in the world, including the Mag Foundation here in St. Paul-de-Vence in the south of France.
When you see this painting, which is just behind me, it's so strong, it's like granite. There is something which is like from the ground, something which is so strong and so intense. And also, I must say, Anne is like that. Alors, Anne.
Jean-Louis.
And she is also volcanic, and she is from this ground, and from your ground, from your country. And between the words and the painting, between the intensity of something which is inside, of course, and outside, it's not to say what you see, it's also to say what you are.
It was with the inauguration of the Mag Foundation in the 60s, early 60s, that our lives, social lives, changed, because there we met many artists and poets and writers. A lot of them would come south in the summer, like Jean-Paul Riopel, with whom we sailed with the children, the great gallerist, Henri Matisse's son, Pierre Matisse, who had a villa at Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, and go to lunch there. Lunch is there on his terrace with Chagall and Miro and Alexander Calder, many of his artists, and all the artists that were in the Mag stable.
Anne Madden and Louis Le Brocquy decided to enrich their lives with children. Their son Alexis was born in 1961, and Pierre arrived just 2 years later in 1963.
You know, I wanted them, said they were love children. It wasn't a surprise, so to speak. And I was also very fortunate in being able to have help. So I can't imagine bringing them up without help and going on painting. I think I would have made a very bad job of both. As it was, I thought I made a bad job of both, even with the help. But I soldiered on. I painted when they were young. I used to stop in the summers. It was pointless trying to work when they were on holiday. There was something about that life that we led in Les Cons, which was paradisal. It was literally paradisal. We were friends under the stars at night with all these children and mingling together, and mingling late, and swimming at night and dancing, and making our own wine and making our own olive oil.
But this sense of paradise was shattered with a 3-page telegram from Peru, informing Anne that her beloved sister Vivian, together with her husband and everyone on board, had been killed in a plane crash. They left behind 3 young children. Anne was one of the 2 named guardians.
We were very, very close, my sister and myself, extremely close. She went to study in Cambridge and to get into university, and I was in London at the art school, but we used to meet up every weekend. I'd go to Cambridge or she'd come down to London. When they were killed, there were 2 guardians were made, legal guardians were made, myself, who was their maternal aunt, and their paternal aunt. And between us, we brought them up. That was that.
Having lost her father and her sister in such tragic circumstances, Anne would now lose her only brother, Jeremy. The effect was devastating.
It was when he was 40. He had an accident. He fell, had a very bad fall, down some very dangerous stairs at his girlfriend's flat, and broke his pelvis, and he died 2 days later. I can imagine that being a mother might have affected my work, but I don't really think it did. Not like the deaths that really did freeze me. In fact, it halted me in my tracks and sent me into very dark places, very. And after my brother's death, Samuel Beckett was extremely helpful to me. He'd seen me, of course, in Paris, and we talked of it, and he wrote and said, "Don't be depressed. It is it trying to be said." And by the it, he meant the dark. And he said, "You must tackle your dark." He urged me to tackle my dark.
I mean, there have been occasions, I remember talking to her when she said that she's been too miserable to work and has often wondered if she'll ever work again. But I think that instinctively she is an artist. She's an artist at heart, and to the deepest core of her being. And I think that is what always brings her back into the studio. And I think in an odd way, that's why space is so important in her work, because it always does evoke often a vast space, a big space. And I think it's that kind of imaginative space, a privileged imaginative space, that it's important for her to hold on to.
The garden paintings, the boxes of light, and the paths of light are all related insofar as they were all attempts on my part to retrieve the studio, a kind of box of light in itself, after my brother's death. In many ways, it was nature, the effulgence and sensual wealth and richness of nature that helped me to return to the studio and brought about the garden paintings, which are to do with life, of course. The winged figure came about because I wanted to do a painting for this documentary, especially for it, where, as you asked me, to film me painting. So that's how it began.
Certainly what I've witnessed over the years is the risks you take, the tremendous risks you take, which is,
The game I play.
Which is, I suppose, the game that all true artists play. It's come through, to my mind, with tremendous evocative power and great beauty. And so I'm looking forward to seeing it installed in Paris, in the Collège des Irlandais. But it is wonderful. For me, in my mind, it looks, if I can define it this way, they look like magic mirrors that catch the light in which it dances, celebrating the glorious and tremendous evocative power of light. But your work is, I think, unique in the very nature of the surface that you have created, particularly in recent years, and it's epitomized in this work, to my mind.
All art should be triumphant. All art should be a triumph over pain, tragedy, loss. But to achieve that, you have to work through maybe a lot of stages. And I'm not saying that there isn't art which is any the lesser, because it doesn't. But one would hope that that was happening when you see somebody's work over a span of time.
Well, the demons that assail all artists. They're the demons of self-doubt. What am I doing? Is it valid? How can I tell whether it is or whether it isn't? These are questions that all real artists ask themselves, and it always happens at night, in the middle of the night, and wakes you up with the most terrible feeling when you think you've had quite a good day in the studio, and you're assailed by them. They come in at you, and I think they're necessary.
She talks about the void and the desert within the self, that when she lays open a canvas, it's like the empty floor of her being, and then she composes and creates from that. And while paint is primary, the image is not entirely secondary. It's almost equiprimordial at times and equally important.
I walk around them. I know where the top and the bottom is, or maybe I don't. I turn it upside down in the middle. But I'm going around it and stalking it. And I make it as difficult as I can for myself. And it's the game I play. I like playing that game. I like to gamble all for nothing. And to make it hard. I think it's to risk. As Anne said, with each step, meaning each brushstroke, with each step, I risk my life. And I know what he means. I know what he means. And I want to do that. I want to actually live that in my paintings, to risk everything for nothing. I don't want to know what I'm doing. There's no recipe for painting. There's no recipe for my painting, but I don't want one. I want to not know, and for something to come there that I didn't know was there from me. The municipality offered this room to me to do anything I liked in. I at first hesitated to accept because I couldn't think what on earth I would do. And very, very quickly, an idea came to me, like out of the blue, literally out of the blue. And it was the idea of a vault, the vault of the sky, Mediterranean sky, which I'd lived under for the last 30 years. Put onto the vault, the architectural vault. And the sun form was always regarded in mythological times as it's why it's called imperious. The Empyrean was where the gods lived. Well, it's the first time I've seen it a distance in time from when I did it. And when you do something, it is very difficult to see it, I suppose, in any objective kind of way. So one tends to be extremely unsure of the result. And so coming back here is very useful to me because I see it for the first time for 4 or 5 years. And so I can see it almost as if somebody else had done it. And that is the only way I can possibly evaluate it, is in an objective kind of way. And I think it's, I'm rather pleased to see it again. I'm rather pleased. I was asked to do a painting for an exhibition of famine paintings. And I thought of these boats on this vast ocean. And I tried to think of the desolation of the people on the boat by making the boat tiny in this huge space, unknown space, dangerous space for them, also a dangerous space for me. So there's so much space and so little boat. It was difficult to hold the painting together. But it was also, I hope, infused with this feeling of desolation from their point of view. And that the size of the boat is poignant. It is meant to be poignant. And I didn't know what I was doing then, but they gradually started telling me this was an odyssey. I could see. And then I made a decision, ordered more canvases, and decided I would do 9 and go from the field of vision to the abyss, to the tragic end of the journey, which is my own journey. That I realized I was the boat.
Most artists that deal with abstraction, they're normally more elusive. They will not talk in the same way that you're making a historical figurative painting. And I think in her paintings, even the very colorful paintings, there is always this idea of Icarus and people being blind by the sun or falling, or there's these boats adrift in immense expanses of sea and things like that. The birds that appear there will be birds of prey. So there is always something menacing. They're very beautiful, but it's something looming or, appearing that may be threatening.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Paintings don't come out of the blue. They come out of, for example, doves cooing in the benign environs of a studio in the south of France. Paintings arise also, in a more drastic way, from the sight of Anne in pain with her spinal injuries in the late 1950s, encased like a cherished goddess in a great plaster sarcophagus.
It came about purely by chance after Louis had been asked by Ted Hickey, the keeper of art at the Ulster Museum, if he would write his autobiography. He said he wouldn't dream of it. And then the poison was dropped in my ear, you know, and it wasn't for a couple of months. I thought, well, maybe I could do something. Maybe I should do something. I was the closest person to him. And I approached Louis, and he said, well, we'll have a go. We'll try. And never at any stage was it a kind of definitive thing. At one moment, he said, I don't think I want my life made public.
I well remember the first letters Anne wrote to me. I knew her to be a writer. Nevertheless, I am still incredulous in face of this spontaneous, difficult feat of hers, giving form and meaning to my incoherent early years, while linking our shared life together. So you could say, this is a book of a painter, by a painter, and for a painter. And since I am the latter one, I want to express before you all my loving thanks and my unbounded admiration for the author. For many years, we worked together in the same studio, where Anne, beyond her own painting, became my third eye, my muse.
Well, I wouldn't have known at all I was his muse. I wouldn't have a clue. If I was his muse, it's something in him. And, I mean, a muse has a role to play, but they play it unconsciously. It's totally unconscious. I certainly never thought of myself like that. No.
I have destroyed oils. In, I think it was 1963, I destroyed a whole year's work. I destroyed something over 40, about 42 oils, big and small. It was a terrible moment, I need hardly say. I had become, as it were, blind. I had no insight. I was painting, to me, meaninglessly. And I was left, as it were, bereft when my wife, Anne Madden, brought me to Paris. She saw my distress. She understood as well, if not better than I did, what was going on. And she brought me to Paris. And sure enough, in Paris, I there did discover, made a discovery of the human reality in the form of these curious heads which were made by the Polynesian, Melanesian civilization. And this brought me on to the Irish obsession with the head, the vision of the old Irish, of the head as the magic box which contains the spirit.
She herself became the subject of many of my presence paintings made during and after her operation, as well as the later head images I made of her. These later heads I found somehow problematic, possibly because of my natural reluctance to distort the features of this beautiful woman, and maybe because I felt I could never capture the complexity of her instinctive and passionate spirit.
When I was packing up Les Combes to leave France and to leave my home after 35 years, you can imagine the kind of amount of papers, letters, photographs, books that had to be sorted out, kept or thrown away. So I was in a sea of all this up in the library, and for literally months, and was haunted by a line of Blake's, in William Blake's, in one of his poems. I went into the garden of love, and I saw it was filled with graves. And this kept returning because it was all to do with memories, and memories of my life there, and Les Combes, and the loss coming. And when I closed my eyes, I had this bit strange eidetic images, which are quite frequent. And they were images of crosses, multiple crosses, in spaces like the sky. And I think really, in an attempt to get rid of them, I painted this series of memorial paintings. The title of A Space of Time comes from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, when he's talking about time and space. And, I mean, obviously, this large painting, 13 meters long, which I worked on for off and on, for 5 years, addresses space and time as well as flight. We love going to Paris, you know, because both Alexis and Pierre live there, and it's an opportunity to see them both, and it's a wonderful opportunity in a beautiful city where we have many friends as well, but seem to spend most of our time with them. The recent show in Paris was very important to me because the works shown are enormous, and one is 13 meters long and the other is 6.5 meters long, and the winged figure is 4 meters by 3.5. And no commercial gallery has the space to show paintings of that size. Not only did a lot of friends come, but then everybody was there. Louis was there, Alexis was there, Pierre. It was a gathering together that hadn't taken place, you know, between old friends that the children knew all their lives. Well, I think that the nervousness that accompanies me at my openings is to do with the feeling of exposure. Exposure that, insofar as the work is up, hanging, people are coming, and I can't escape. Not least because someone has been brave enough to put up my paintings and to show them. But I feel that I'm, in many ways, naked, standing there naked, and knowing that these things that I've done have come from the very floor of my being, my naked self. Paintings do change spaces, don't they? Mm-hmm. They really do. They can. Anyway, it's comforting to see it so well shown, the whole thing.
It has never looked better. None of the paintings has ever looked better.
And it sits there very quietly, that painting.
Yes.
He said it was going to be too much, but I don't think so.
It looks magnificent, and everybody is extremely impressed.
Well, I'm really much more excited about the things that I haven't done than by the things that I have done. I still hope to surprise myself, even though it's a very difficult thing to do when you know that you can't fool yourself.
You ask me, do I think Anne's work is generally underestimated? Let me put it this way. My own estimation and belief in Anne's painting is very far in advance of her present considerable reputation.
Often I feel gravity tugging me down. You know, in the end, I will end up as a little handful of dust. But maybe my spirit, freed, could bound off into the universe.